today, which is one of the interesting aspects about the identity space. There isn't a strict replacement of a technology when a new technology comes out. Typically, new techniques come along to address new scenarios that were not possible before, evolving to increase in complexity. However, the old protocols and approaches, if they still work and there is no direct competitor, they're still in use, right? We all still use username and passwords, even though there are other ways of doing authentication within an application. Right? So the next evolutionary step was intended to solve a specific problem. The scenario I previously described reflected a worldview of personal computing, where one user is using an application pretty much in isolation, and each application is providing its own function. There really was no cross-communication between applications or anything of that nature. Think for a second, though, about what happens inside of a business. Typically a user, in this case an employee, will end up using a collection of applications while performing their job duties. They might need to use an important feature for developers. Within the boundary of an enterprise, directories solve a critical problem. However, that's far from the end in the business world. Once the industry solved the problem of internal identity, they soon discovered that wasn't nearly enough for driving all of their business needs. Consider one of the most straightforward business scenarios, a retailer. A retailer has all of its internal flows and user management requirements, but the business goes beyond the boundaries of its enterprise. A retailer has suppliers, people who their warehouses, which might typically be outsourced, corporate customers with who they might want to have a business or organization relationship, which is different from an individual customer. Internal directories based on single sign-on and authentication within the boundaries of an enterprise no longer work when you have more than one company that needs to collaborate. Right? In particular, think of this scenario. Imagine that there's a web application in the domain on the right that a user from the domain on the left needs to access. The domain controller on the right only knows about users within the boundaries of the company on the right. The user from the other company does not exist in that directory. So now what do? There are lots of different solutions to this problem, but I can assert with authority as a security expert that works for Auth0 that there is one you should not use, the brute force method. It has several significant shortcomings and is generally considered an anti-pattern in the industry. And of course I'm talking about shadow accounts. And shadow accounts are where the administrator for this domain goes and creates an account for that user in their domain. It's where the user has credentials in both domains, right? Shadow accounts take us back to the same problem we had before within the company where we had different apps dealing with their own credentials. The company on the right now has a user from the company on the left in their database. When the user leaves the company on the left, the company on the right doesn't necessarily know. The user can still go to the company on the right's application and gain access. Imagine if I were fired from Auth0 for doing a very poor job in Orlando, but I was still able to go to the Agencia website that we use to book travel and hotels and book myself a European vacation. That would be a very bad thing. That would be like a big red flashing career-ending move for somebody. The industry addressed this problem by raising the level of abstraction in the world of protocols. Kerberos and Active Directory and the things that work at a local network level, sometimes requiring specific network hardware to operate at the network level, we needed to raise the level of abstraction up to the application level. And all of those things are not possible at all of the things like custom hardware that's necessary to run Kerberos is not possible when you're trying to communicate over the public internet. Sorry, I had a little word salad there for a second. Did you follow what I was saying? Okay, great. So inside your company, you can use custom hardware to be able to facilitate single sign-on and that sort of thing. When you're communicating over the public internet, that's not going to work for you because you have no control over the hardware that's being used. There, I said it better. Okay, so people at the time looked at the roles, the messages, the primitives, defined at the network level and created a representation for those things at the higher application level. These protocols were named SAML, or Security Assertion Markup Language. SAML is a protocol that describes the roles entities can play in the context of an identity transaction. An application or a resource became known as a service provider. A source of identities became known as an identity provider, and SAML defines messages that can be exchanged across different entities, specifying high-level transactions used for connecting those two separate entities without knowing the implementation details of either side, kind of like what I was saying earlier. But how does SAML work? Imagine sitting in front of the web application on the domain on the right is a bit of software. The specific kind of software doesn't really matter, but it's often in the form of middleware. And if you're not familiar, middleware is a piece of software that executes in the context of a request and can be built up into chains. So you can have several middlewares that act on the request as it's coming in. But generally, the application middleware sits in front of it is completely unaware of that functionality being executed. The application can remain agnostic to the middleware, while the middleware still has a chance to get in there and manipulate or respond to the request itself. Right? Middleware tends to implement orthogonal concerns to the application that's using it, which allows the application to remain ignorant of SAML concerns. In the example of two companies collaborating, the one on the right must configure their system to have a trust relationship with the one on the left. And trust means the application for the company on the right will believe anything the identity provider on the left says about a user. If the identity provider on the left says that a user is valid and authenticated correctly, the application on the right will trust that assertion. The concept of trust is basically this. It says, I'm an application and I trust this source of identity information is telling me the truth. If it's lying to me, I have no way of really validating that, right? I have a trust that you're going to do it. So you only want to set up a trust relationship with companies that you actually trust to do that, right? You're not just going to do it willy-nilly with every company that comes along. Within the users in the domain on the left request, when a user on the domain on the left requests access to the application in the domain on the right, the SAML implementation in the middleware will intercept the request and determine that that user is not authenticated. The SAML implementation then crafts a sign-in message using a well-known format and redirects the browser of the user to the trusted identity provider in the domain on the left. That provider is some local resource to the user from the company on the left. In most cases, the user is already authenticated with that identity provider because it's within the boundaries of the company and the company on the left's enterprise. This is a good demonstration how various protocols layer on top of each other to provide additional functionality. The company on the left could be an entirely Microsoft shop using Active Directory to provide directory services to the company, and the company on the right could be using a completely different directory service. The SAML implementation sitting on top of both sides provides a seamless integration point translating between the two boundaries. Are you guys following what I'm saying? I'm starting to see some glazing over a little bit. Am I going too fast? No? Okay, good. So many young faces in this crowd. It's awesome. I'm glad you guys are security curious. So continuing with the SAML flow, once the user successfully authenticates, the identity provider on the left issues an entity called a security token. A security token is just a bunch of bits that represents proof that the user has successfully authenticated with that provider. A SAML-based security token consists of an XML payload and a digital signature, which is critical for establishing that trust relationship between the two companies. The digital signature provides confidence that the content of the XML payload is truly coming from the trusted identity provider in the company on the left, as opposed to something that was injected into the middle of the request from anywhere on the internet. This concept is key to maintaining trust. When the company on the right can say they trust what the identity provider on the left says about users, but there must be a way to verify the messages are actually coming from the identity provider on the left. Another aspect of SAML security token is that it can contain the user-specific attributes that describe right? Unless it's required for the business function, like if they're going to ship me something, they might capture the shipping address, right? Which completely removes the shadow account anti-pattern littering the directory of the company on the right's directory. The medium here makes all the difference. The passport is allegedly difficult to counterfeit. Allegedly. Whoever receives it can validate that it's a good passport and can have trust that the U.S. government states that my name is Robert Presley Johnson, right? The Post-it note, on the other hand, has no credibility at all. It could have come from anywhere. I may not even have written it. I may have picked it up in a parking lot somewhere, right? So you'd never trust the Post-it note, but the issuance of the passport itself demonstrates the credibility of my identity when using the passport. Right. Claims can be specified by the protocol or by the issuing authority of the token. So SAML itself defines several claims in its spec, and two of them are issuer and audience. The issuer claim says who issued the token, which could be figured out based on the signature through some mathematic methods, but having a string that represents the origin is nice for visually looking at the token and being able to validate that it's valid. The audience claim is also critical as it restricts the actions that a user can perform within a system. So when I do the SAML-based authentication to access a single application from another domain, I'm going to be scoped to only being allowed to access that application. I won't be able to access other applications within that domain. And that's what the audience claim does for me. Tokens are also scoped as an audience by the audience claim. Resources that receive tokens which are not for the appropriate audience claim can reject them, right? So I don't even need to validate the signature. If I can look at that audience claim in my application and say that's not the audience I'm expecting, I can just drop the request and not do anything. So consider your checking account at your bank. If you receive a check that's made out to someone other than you, you will not accept it because your bank would never cash that check, right? The bank can see that the check is for someone else, and you can see that it's for someone else, even though it's a valid check. It has a routing number, it has an account number, has a signature, date, amount. It's for someone else, so you would never accept that. You just throw it away. Security tokens kind of work the same way. Finally, security tokens can contain an arbitrary claim as well. For instance, this token says that the user has blue hair. Consuming an application may or not care to use that claim, but it can trust that the origin of the identity provider asserts that the claim is valid. So to recap, the user from the company on the left used their browser to access the application inside the company on the right's domain. The SAML middleware determined that the user was not authenticated and redirected them back to their identity provider that it trusts on the left. The identity provider on the left uses something like Kuberos to authenticate the user and then generates a security token to send along the user back to the application on the right. The SAML middleware validates the token by checking its signature, its audience, and the issuer. And once the middleware concludes that the token coming from a trusted source is valid, it considers the user authenticated at that point. And then it can drop a session cookie, right? And then each incoming request to that application just uses the session cookie. We don't need to do the SAML dance for every single request that's coming through. Once we've validated the user is authenticated, they just behave like anybody else in that network at that point. All right. So this lengthy description of SAML has a silver lining to it. I'm not going to make you go through that all again. And that silver lining is that the concepts don't only apply to SAML. Most modern authentication systems follow this same pattern. So far, we've been exploring years of history of the identity space in the world of business. Some of this stuff was thought up in the 70s. Meanwhile, the consumer world, the public internet, was pretty much at a standstill. Like all the early websites were all just username and password based, right? Each public-facing website allowed customers to log in with a username and password and access their services. But a problem arose when those services began attempting to access other publicly available services on the user's behalf. So consider this following scenario. Say I'm a generic internet user that uses LinkedIn. LinkedIn decides that it would like to take advantage of the fact that I have a Gmail account and I have a list of contacts in my Gmail account. They would like to harvest those contacts and send them invite emails to join my LinkedIn network. Right? For this example, assume that Gmail has some kind of API that they use in their applications to send emails, list contacts and other similar email type things, and LinkedIn just wants to consume those APIs on my behalf. A common pattern that even exists today to solve this problem is for LinkedIn to ask me for my Gmail credentials. Right? Gmail has a database containing username and password credentials and user attributes similar to what I have described before, and LinkedIn simply asks for those credentials, which it stores in its database for when it wants to access my Gmail-based API on my behalf. But giving your Gmail username and password to LinkedIn presents a significant problem. It might be legitimate for LinkedIn and Gmail and myself to want to do this, like LinkedIn accessing my contacts and sending out invites. That sounds like a use case that's valuable, right? Yeah, I'm an old guy. That's how I find jobs. Because I want to expand my LinkedIn network. It's to the advantage to all the parties involved to implement that functionality, is basically what I'm trying to say. But the implementation, as I've described it so far, is terrible. And I must rely on LinkedIn to protect my Gmail credentials at this point, right? LinkedIn might not be as committed to protecting my Gmail credentials because they don't own them. Gmail does, right? Note that I'm only using LinkedIn and Gmail here as an example. I'm not trying to say anything nefarious about their engineering teams. I'm sure they're all wonderful people and they would never let any of these scenarios happen. But can you trust Twitch? Can you trust Twitter? I mean, like, how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go with that scenario, right? What happens if LinkedIn doesn't adequately secure the connection between my browser and their site when I happen to be on the screen that they ask me for my credentials? If I'm at Starbucks, passing them my Gmail credentials, and they're stored in a log somewhere in an insecure way, right? Of course, Gmail would never allow that to happen because the Gmail credentials are critical to them for their business function, right? But LinkedIn, on the other hand, maybe not. They are asking for credentials for a one-off little feature of their application, and it's not as critical to them. But the problem actually might be more obscure than that. Maybe LinkedIn uses, I said that, centralized logging. So let's move on to the next, even more subtle problem. And that problem is giving LinkedIn my Gmail username and password. LinkedIn has full access to my Gmail account. I have not limited them in scope to only being able to look at my contacts or sending email on my behalf. They're able to view all of my contacts and send any email they want to anyone. They can even delete my account with my credentials, right? So in general, people should never give their credentials to any place other than the origin of those credentials, right? So you go and log into Gmail, those credentials are only to be given back to Gmail to authenticate yourself, just like we talked about earlier, where I come back to load my digital identity. The industry solved this big problem in a fairly organic way. And what I mean by that is that there was no significant big community effort to solve this problem. Companies just started coming up with solutions, and those solutions kind of solidified into a solution itself. The industry introduced that solution as OAuth, I guess about 10 years ago, OAuth 1 first came out. And OAuth is a delegated authorization protocol, as I mentioned earlier. It allows a user to delegate authorization to one resource to act on a third resource without exposing my credentials to the third-party resource. OAuth is a standard that defines two endpoints, which resources such as Gmail and LinkedIn can expose for helping people do delegated authorization flows. It also describes how a client should consume such a resource in a delegated fashion, explicitly prescribing the messages that can be used for requesting such access. Let's go back to the scenario. Say that I'm signed in with LinkedIn, and they want to harvest my Gmail contacts like I previously described. Following OAuth, LinkedIn directs my browser to what is called an authorization server hosted by Gmail. An authorization server is just a collection of two endpoints defined by OAuth. An authorization endpoint, which serves up UI, and a token endpoint, which deals with API access. Gmail's authorization server receives the redirected request from LinkedIn, and this request is formatted to say something along the lines of, "Dear Gmail, I'm LinkedIn. You know me because I've registered with you, and I am a known client. Here I have a user. I would like you to grant access to their contacts and the ability to send emails on behalf of this user that I'm sending with." At this point, my browser is pointed at Gmail's web server, their services. Gmail will authenticate my session if I'm not currently logged in. It'll prompt me to log in, and in that scenario, I'm doing it correctly. I'm sending my credentials to Gmail, not LinkedIn. And once Gmail has verified my Gmail credentials, it examines the incoming request and prompts me saying, "Dear user, here's LinkedIn. They would like to access your contacts and to send emails on your behalf. Are you okay with that?" It gives me the opportunity to say, no, I don't want to grant that access. It's asking me for consent to grant LinkedIn access to those features of Gmail. I, as a user, am given a chance to respond that I'm okay with that. Once granted that permission, Gmail's authorization server will generate an authorization code and redirect my browser back to LinkedIn with it. The authorization code is an opaque string as far as LinkedIn is concerned. Only Gmail knows anything about it. And so far, what I've described, this process, this handshake, is being performed directly within my browser over the public internet. So I went to LinkedIn. They flashed up some kind of banner saying, "Hey, check out our new Gmail contacts harvesting feature. Do you want to try it?" And I clicked that button, and then LinkedIn redirected my browser over to Gmail with the message crafted in a certain way. I authenticated, granted consent, and then Gmail redirected my browser back over to LinkedIn with a code, right? And this type of communication all happening within your browser is commonly referred to as front channel communication. And the next part of the steps that happen in this handshake, this OAuth handshake, happens on the servers themselves. LinkedIn servers communicate directly with Gmail servers, and that type of communication is commonly referred to as back channel communication. So you have front channel communication, back channel communication. LinkedIn will take that authorization code along with a set of client credentials and call Gmail's authorization server's token endpoint. This message says something along the lines of, "Dear Gmail, I am LinkedIn, here's proof. I have a code that proves the user gave consent for me to access your APIs on their behalf." Note that LinkedIn got Gmail client credentials when it registered with Gmail as a known client. If any of you guys have ever set up like Twitter authentication or registered an app on Facebook, it's exactly the same registration process, right? You go on and you give it a little bit of information about your application, and they hand you back a client ID and a client secret. Exact same thing we're talking about here. That's all based on OAuth. Gmail's authorization server will first evaluate the client credentials and then the authorization code. If everything checks out, it'll generate two artifacts. The first artifact is an opaque access token. I, as a user, consented to giving access, and this token proves that, as well as the permissions I granted. So the claims that LinkedIn requested of me and that I consented to. These permissions are typically expressed in the context of OAuth scopes. I say this is an opaque token because it contains no valuable information for LinkedIn. The token only has meaning to Gmail, its issuer. The OAuth specification has no advice for the format of the token itself, beyond the capability of being able to convey meaning back to Gmail, the issuer of the token. And that's important, and I'll get to why that's important in a couple minutes. Secondly, an opaque refresh token is generated if you request one. If LinkedIn wishes to maintain Gmail API access when I am the user is not available, they can use the refresh token to request a new access token. Access tokens are typically very short-lived because you want them to die off fast in case you don't want them to leak out into the internet, because that's what's actually used to access your API. So they usually come with a short expiration date. Your refresh tokens, on the other hand, are very long-lived and can be used to fetch a new access token. So once your access token expires, you use a refresh token to get a new access token, just carry on. But there's another benefit to the refresh token. When I'm doing that exchange, taking my refresh token and requesting another access token, it gives Gmail the opportunity of reevaluating whether it should grant that access token. So from the time when I originally granted consent to LinkedIn to access the Gmail APIs on my behalf, I might have revoked that consent and said, no, I don't want you to have that access anymore. If LinkedIn attempts to use the refresh token to get another access token, it'll deny it. It'll drop it on the floor. All right, so this is how the industry solved the delegation problem. And OAuth 2 is a very popular protocol today. Of course, things didn't end there. Quickly, people started to use OAuth not for delegation, but as an authentication mechanism. So consider our final scenario. Imagine that LinkedIn doesn't want to maintain a username and password database. They would have absolutely no way of having a user sign in directly to their service, but LinkedIn could use the same OAuth dance that I just described to you guys to gain delegated access to Gmail with an anonymous user, and as soon as the OAuth flow is completed successfully, LinkedIn could assume that since the user has proven that they are a valid Gmail user, they are considered and authenticated in LinkedIn as well, and drop a session cookie and just continue going on. But remember when I said that OAuth's access tokens are opaque? The token issued by Gmail has no meaning to LinkedIn. If someone manages to make an attack and manipulate that access token in some way, LinkedIn has no way of telling that that happened. Right? I could receive an access token that's for a completely different user, and LinkedIn would not know and would have absolutely no way of knowing. From LinkedIn's standpoint, the only thing they can do with that token is send it back to Gmail with a request. Right? This pattern is, or this flaw is so common, or was so common when it was found, it's known as the confused deputy attack. And both Facebook and Twitter had this flaw when they first introduced social logins. They don't now, you can rest assured. Problem 2 is that this approach cannot be generalized. When I described SAML earlier, I said that if I know that a website uses SAML, I can connect to it. That is because all of the messages in SAML are well to build that SDK on my behalf. In this scenario, the OAuth access token is opaque to LinkedIn. The only way to use it is to send it back to Gmail with a request. And Gmail might hang an API out there that says, hey, use your access token on this endpoint, and I'll give you user data back about the token that you handed me. Facebook could do that too. And any provider that happens to implement their social logins this way could do that as well, but it's not standardized. It might all do it slightly differently, right? So you can't really wrap a library around that functionality. You'd have to write one-off code for every one of these authentication mechanisms that you wanted to consume. Yeah. So the industry took a look at OAuth and decided to solve that specific problem. And the way they did it is they added details on top of OAuth with a new specification called OpenId Connect. OpenId Connect takes OAuth and adds primitives for correctly achieving single sign-on. OpenId Connect adds a new type of token called an ID token. And this token is no longer opaque. It follows a set standard as well, the JSON Web Token, or JOT for short. This token is meant to carry pretty much the same information I described as a SAML token. It carries user information and can be validated in exactly the same way. OIDC also introduces a standard API interface to the authorization server for querying identity information called a user info endpoint. Finally, OpenID Connect introduces a way to get ID tokens directly as a part of the authorization endpoint flow, which brings the public internet up to parity with SAML. So when you're using OpenID Connect, you're still using OAuth underneath. It's what holds it up. And in that same request flow, you're requesting both an access token, a refresh token, and an ID token all in one request, right? And now you successfully can validate that ID token that it's valid, and know that you're dealing with the user that you think you want in, right? And now we basically come to modern times. OpenID Connect is the state of the art at this point for identity protocols. We've now visited the main scenarios that prompted the evolution of those protocols in the identity space. And of course, this was just kind of a taste of what identity is all about to you guys. The world is very big and very detailed. And if I piqued your interest in it at all, I suggest you go read the RFCs for OAuth and OpenID Connect. If you're reading the SAML specs, I'm really sorry for you.
RFCs?
Yes, basically the RFCs, the request for comment, the documentation of the spec itself that was actually locked in place and said this is the spec. And that's about it. That's all I have for you guys. If you are interested in hearing me speak again, or interested in reading some of my writing, or just my rants on Twitter, I do that. There's my Twitter. I also do live stream on Twitch. So you can find my Twitch channel there. I'm a member of a team of live coders. There's about 35 of us that all do free content on Twitch. And you can always find one of us streaming, generally 24 hours a day. And then I infrequently blog on IamNotMyself.com. That's all I got.
Thanks, Robbie. That was awesome. I gotta say, I've connected to each and every one of those different things.
Yeah.
I was writing down, but I had no idea what it was. I just knew how to do the stuff.
So one of the things that's interesting about OAuth anyway is because Facebook and Twitter kind of jumped out there ahead with doing their social logins using OAuth, there's a lot of bad information out there when you go to Google around OAuth, and it gets really confusing really fast. So now that I've told you the difference between OAuth and OpenID Connect, you can throw away all that bad information and maybe have better searching in Google for those topics. Yes?
I had a question kind of more away from the delegated side. I was curious if service architecture or any kind of service architecture, could you use any of these kind of technologies or specs to talk to your services so that they have certain authorization, like a certain service, you know, so you're reducing your security footprint so that, you know, an invoice system doesn't have access to attributes that it shouldn't have access to.
So OAuth itself, the specification has, I've been using the word flow, and we've been talking about user flows at this point. There are several different user flows, but there are also non-user flows. And one of them is called client credentials. And the client credentials flow is explicitly for computer-to-computer communication. Yeah.
So that channel.
Yes, yeah. Well, it could also be like for maybe a CLI tool or something like that, but yeah, usually server-to-server communication. Yes, sir.
I got two questions. One, are you the 12th man?
We are all the 12th.
And then my second question is it alright to say auth-0 or is it auth-0?
It's auth-0, yeah.
Okay.
And I'll tell you a funny story about that. I originally thought that the reason the company was named the way it is that in computer science there's a networking layer model that talks about how communication over TCP happens, and it happens in a layered model, and the very lowest layer is called layer 0. And so I thought that Auth0 was a play on that, talking about it was the authorization layer 0 authentication. This summer, I was at an offsite with a CEO, and I told him that guess, and it's not. But he wouldn't tell me what it meant. He said, "No, go back and try again, and tell me next year." So, if anybody else has an idea, I don't know.
The secret is it doesn't mean anything.
It just sounds, it makes it sound all techy.
Alright, we have another question over here.
No, I was just gonna say an available domain name.
Yeah, possibly. I don't know.
That's
What is Auth0?
Yeah, so Auth0 is a identity as a service platform. So it's a cloud provider just like Azure or AWS is for your running instances or applications to run in, but what we deal with is identity as a service, so authenticating users. So all of the protocols that I described in this talk, we support those, and which isn't in itself anything wonderful, but where the magic sauce for Auth0 comes into play is where we start bridging them. So your applications depend on OAuth tokens, but we can authenticate users in Active Directory and bridge them to OAuth. Or you have some custom solution, and then our platform is able to link multiple applications together and give you single sign-on, that sort of thing. So that's what we sell.
I've never heard of Auth0, but Gitya has an authentication layer. And they use tokens on both sides. I was wondering if and it's kind of handoff and whatever language you're using.
Sure.
But I was wondering, like, where would that fit? Because it's not SAML, it's not regular, like.
So OAuth is not the only player in the space. Gig is one of our competitors. Okta is another big competitor to us. Pingdom is another big competitor. And I say that the OAuth spec does not offer any guidance on the tokens, like they're opaque to the consumer, right? But most of the big players in the field, all of their tokens are jobs. So if you're using Auth0 and you get an access token, you can still look at it as a job and see the data that's in it. The OAuth spec itself doesn't say that. Recently there was a conference in Germany that our principal engineer went to, and he submitted an addendum to OAuth. It wouldn't change the spec, but it would give a recommended implementation that specifies JWTs as a format for all access tokens. That's not been accepted yet. So, yeah. One more?
Yeah.
This is more about getting your feet on the future. I know nowadays people are wanting to move away from using passwords and authentication, especially with something like biometrics, like face. The schemes that you described in the presentation, are they affected by that at all, or does that just change what data is transmitted?
I think it would change the user interface of what's being used, right? So when we implement passwordless, right? And passwordless is you go to a website, you plug in your email address, and then you get an email with a specially formatted link, and you click on that link and you're authenticated into a service, right? Slack does that. That's all still OAuth. It's just the user interface you're interacting with is different, and we're maintaining control of the password. And I'm actually working on another talk that would feed right into that I'll probably be doing in the coming year. It's called Passwords Have Failed. And nobody in this room passwords have failed for, but for your mom or your grandma, passwords have failed, right? Because they've got to log into 500 places. They're not going to have a unique password for every single place. They're not going to give some random website their password to their bank account, right? We need to solve that problem. OAuth, SAML, OpenID Connect are going to be the things that are underpinning that solution. We're going to build something on top of that that solves the problem for your mom.
Yeah. There's another question in the back.
Yeah. Is any of the people that you've dealt with in the identity space, are they working towards using zero knowledge protocols at all for anything authentication-wise?
Zero knowledge protocols. I'm not familiar with the term. I know there are several technologies that are coming down the pipe that are like built into your browser, like WebAuthn.
Okay. Well, so the general idea is that I have a secret, you also know the secret, I will communicate the fact that I have that secret to you without conveying anything about the secret at all. So the password doesn't go through. I
So,
solve a problem in my
public-private
space.
key encryption sort of thing, or?
Yes, but without passing the key. Without.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
But I'm happy to go back to work and ask the big brainy guys that never go on the road that question. You can email me and I'll get back to you on it.
I thought I saw one other question. Was there?
Another question.
Right here.
I'm not really that familiar with authentication, so this is going to be kind of a stupid question.
Sure. Everybody's got to start somewhere.
Yeah. So one of the ways companies fingerprint different users is they'll look at, say, like your browser side, the viewport they're using, the size of your monitor, and they'll store that metadata somewhere. And does OAuth deal with any part of that in terms of digital footprinting, or is that?
OAuth does not, no.
So that's
as a feature in Auth0, yes, we do anomaly detection. And it's usually location based, right? If you logged in Seattle and 20 minutes later you logged in Atlanta, that second login is probably not valid.
Okay.
And we're going to do some kind of two-factor authentication to make sure that second login is valid.
So the authentication is done before the OAuth, right?
Yeah, OAuth is strictly a protocol about delegated authorization. Right?
Okay.
That's all its intended purpose is.
Okay, just handshake.
Yep.
I gotcha.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you, Bob.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you everybody for coming out and sticking around. And we have our next meetup is on May 6th. It should be a great one. So hopefully we'll see you there. And before you go, I ask two favors of you. Number one, if you haven't eaten food, eat some more food, or feel free to take some with you. We don't want to bring it home. And then number two, we need some volunteers just to help. We're going to put these chairs back, move the tables out, and clean up. So if you can stick around and help us do that, that'd be great.